Some ghosts don't haunt because they're dead. They haunt because the truth refused to stay buried. On a quiet Thursday evening in Savannah, Georgia, the Whitmore house sat in a heavy stillness. The warm, humid air drifted in through the open windows, carrying the faint scent of the nearby marshes and the slow hum of cicadas in the oak trees. Inside, Clara Whitmore sat alone on a leather sofa, one leg tucked under her, a half-empty glass of Merlot in her right hand. The television was on but muted, a muted flicker in the corner that only deepened the silence. 3 days earlier, she had been at what everyone believed was her husband's funeral. It had been the kind of service that people called tasteful, white lilies and roses, soft music, hushed voices. But there was no casket. No open lid for loved ones to say a final goodbye. Instead, there was a polished mahogany urn displayed at the front of the chapel, holding what Clara told everyone were Jonathan Whitmore's ashes. She stood beside it, dressed in black, offering polite nods and softly spoken thanks to people who barely knew her but felt compelled to attend. She cried in the right places. She let her voice catch when she talked about how sudden it had been, how Jonathan's heart, strong as it seemed, had simply given out. She spoke about stress, about how it wore down even the most resilient men, about how life could turn without warning. It was a performance, and it worked. No one questioned it. What no one knew was that Jonathan's death had been neither sudden nor natural. It had been planned for months, designed with the kind of patience and precision only certain people are capable of. Each step measured. Each move rehearsed. And Clara had been proud of that. That pride was still with her now, 3 days later, as she sat in her living room, wine warming in her hand, the world outside believing her to be a grieving widow. She was supposed to feel relief. Freedom. The finality of a chapter closed. Instead, she heard something she shouldn't have. It was faint at first, the delicate metallic scrape of a key sliding into the front door lock. Her head turned, frowning, certain she had imagined it. She was the only one with a key now. The sound came again, followed by the slow, steady creak of the door opening. Her back straightened, fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. A shadow moved in the hallway. Then a man stepped into the room. For a moment, Clara's brain refused to process what she was seeing. He was dressed in a tailored dark suit, crisp white shirt open at the collar. His hair was neatly combed, his posture calm and deliberate. But her eyes locked on his wrist, the gold watch, unmistakable, the one she had last seen resting on Jonathan's nightstand the night he died. It should have been ash. Her grip loosened, and the glass slipped from her hand. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, exploding into jagged fragments. The Merlot bled into the white stone in slow rivulets, spreading in a dark, uneven stain that looked, to her, like blood seeping into the grout. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush forward. He simply stood there, eyes fixed on hers, and said quietly, "Hello, Clara." His voice was steady, deliberate, carrying the kind of weight that made her knees weaken. She swallowed hard, trying to find words, but nothing came. Her mind snapped through the facts: she had poisoned him, she had watched him drink, she had watched his body carried away, she had held the urn in her hands. All of that had happened. It had to have happened. And yet, here he was. The air between them felt heavy, electric. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its tires hissing on wet pavement. A dog barked in the distance. The world beyond these walls moved on as if nothing had changed. But inside, reality had shifted entirely. This wasn't about love that had curdled into hate. This wasn't about jealousy or a sudden burst of rage. This was about calculation, a murder built like a clock, each gear and spring placed with care, each moment timed. And now, standing in front of her, was proof that somewhere in that careful construction, she had made a mistake. The worst kind of mistake. She studied his face, looking for signs, any indication that this was some elaborate trick or a hallucination brought on by her own guilt. But there was nothing in his expression except quiet certainty. He knew everything. And in that long, breathless moment, Clara understood, the truth she had buried so carefully was clawing its way back to the surface. The man she thought she had killed was alive. Or at least, someone wearing his face was. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her chest tight and unwilling to expand fully. She thought about the months of preparation, the research, the rehearsals, the conversations she had crafted to guide suspicion away from herself. All of it worthless now. There was a smell in the room she hadn't noticed before, the faint scent of his cologne, the same one Jonathan had always worn. It cut through her thoughts like a blade, pulling her back into the past, into evenings where she'd sat across from him at the dinner table, pretending to listen, pretending to care, all the while imagining the moment he would be gone for good. She realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly, steadying herself. "I don't understand," she said at last, her voice barely audible. He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, I think you do." The words landed with the finality of a locked door. What came next would unravel everything, every lie she had told, every false tear she had shed. And once it began, there would be no way to stop it. Because some ghosts don't haunt because they're dead. They haunt because they've been waiting for the right moment to come back. To understand how this crime unfolded, we have to step back, long before the night of the shattered wine glass, long before a cold-eyed man appeared in that doorway. Because in stories like this, the truth doesn't begin with the murder. It begins with the lives that collided to make it possible. David Mercer was born in 1982 in Shreveport, Louisiana, on a sweltering August afternoon that felt like the whole city was breathing through a wet cloth. His mother, Angela, was just 20 years old, exhausted, and scared. His father? Gone before David even learned to walk. But David wasn't alone in that hospital bassinet. Born only 6 minutes later was his identical twin, Daniel. Same sharp jawline, same blue-gray eyes, same DNA, but their lives would take opposite turns almost from the beginning. Angela raised them the best she could, cleaning houses during the day and taking shifts at a diner at night. By the time the boys were teenagers, David had developed a knack for organization, a gift for making things run smoothly, whether it was his high school's fundraiser or a side hustle delivering, no questions asked, packages for older kids in the neighborhood. Daniel, on the other hand, gravitated toward trouble. He had a restless energy, a need for adrenaline. By their 20s, the differences were stark. David had built a quiet empire in the shadows of the Gulf Coast, running a logistics company, import-export, he'd tell people. The goods that moved through his warehouses weren't always legal, but they were never sloppy. Electronics, luxury items, sometimes exotic animals, never drugs. Drugs brought heat, and heat got people caught. David played the long game. Daniel played no game at all. Between 2003 and 2004, he robbed 3 banks in less than 7 months. Each job was riskier than the last, and each time he got away, his confidence grew. Until one didn't. An armed guard was shot during his 3rd heist. A customer died in the chaos. When the trial was over, Daniel was handed 25 years to life in federal prison. 400 miles away in Atlanta, Georgia, another life was unfolding. Emily Carter was born in 1986, the youngest of 3 in a family that knew struggle the way most people know routine. Her father was a mechanic by day and a cab driver by night. Her mother worked in a laundromat until arthritis stole her hands. By the time Emily was a teenager, she'd learned 2 hard truths: money meant power, and the people who had it never got there by playing fair. Emily was beautiful, movie scene beautiful, but she learned early that beauty was only leverage if you knew how to use it. She could listen like she cared, laugh like she meant it, and remember every detail a man let slip about what he wanted most in the world. By her 20s, she had cycled through 3 serious relationships, each one wealthier than the last, each one ending when she got bored or when they realized she was only ever half in love with them. In 2009, fate, or maybe just coincidence, brought Emily and David to the same luxury car show in Dallas, Texas. David was there for business, the kind that required a public setting with plenty of handshakes and no paper trails. Emily was there on the arm of a man she'd been dating for 6 months, a tech entrepreneur with more money than common sense. David noticed her before she noticed him, how she lingered over a cherry-red convertible, how she laughed too easily at her boyfriend's awkward jokes. When their eyes met, something passed between them. David didn't need to ask for her number, she gave it willingly, slipping the card into his palm like a secret. When she asked what he did for a living, he smiled and said, "Import-export." That was all. The rest she could figure out, or not. By the end of 2010, they were living together in a sleek condo in Houston. 2 years later, they were married in a ceremony that was equal parts elegant and discreet. There were no grand speeches, no social media tags, no guest list full of strangers. David didn't need attention, he needed control. And Emily, for now, was willing to give him both. But marriages built on convenience and mutual benefit rarely stay that way. By 2015, the balance between them had shifted. The love, or whatever they'd been calling it, was thinning out, replaced by suspicion and long absences. Federal agents had begun sniffing around David's shipping business. Not aggressively, but in the way that makes a smart man nervous, slow, methodical, gathering details. David noticed. And so did Emily. One night, while he was on yet another trip he refused to explain, Emily's phone rang. The name on the screen made her pause, Elliot Mason. She hadn't heard from him in over a decade. Elliot was 61 now, a career con artist whose schemes had once been the stuff of whispered legend, insurance scams, Ponzi-like investments, real estate flips that ended with lawsuits instead of profits. If manipulation was an art form, Elliot was Picasso. They started talking. At first it was light, catching up on years lost. Then he began asking about her life, about David. "You look happy in those photos," Elliot said once, "but you don't sound happy." She laughed it off, but in the quiet after they hung up, the words dug under her skin. Elliot knew how to plant seeds, and Emily knew how to water them. She told him about David's trips, the secret of calls, the bank accounts she wasn't allowed to touch. She mentioned the life insurance policy she'd stumbled across while looking for tax documents, $800,000 with her as the sole beneficiary. And then the kicker, a clause that doubled the payout if death was accidental or due to an undetected medical condition. That was the moment the plan began to take shape, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle forming in the shadows. It was the summer of 2016 when the first subtle fractures began to appear in their seemingly solid life together. Jackson Cole had built his reputation as a man who got things done, no questions asked. His import-export company, based out of New Orleans, looked legitimate on paper, but anyone who had been around the docks long enough knew that Jackson's cargo wasn't always the kind that got declared on customs forms. Electronics, high-end cars, and sometimes rarer goods, items that carried higher profit margins and even higher risks. To the outside world, Jackson was a success story. He drove a black Escalade with tinted windows, wore tailored suits that made him look more like a politician than a man who knew every back alley and unmarked door between the Mississippi River and the Gulf. His wife, Vanessa Cole, fit perfectly into the picture, elegant, well-spoken, the kind of woman who could sit next to him at a charity gala without anyone guessing the kind of people who called his phone after midnight. But behind the polished surface, their home was starting to feel less like a partnership and more like a waiting room for an inevitable disaster. The federal investigation wasn't a raid or a knock on the door, it was quieter than that, slower. Weeks would pass without anything happening, then an old associate would call Jackson to say a few guys in suits had been asking questions down at the port. Jackson tried to brush it off. "They're fishing," he'd tell Vanessa over dinner, cutting his steak with calm, deliberate movements. "They've got nothing on me." But Vanessa noticed the way he always kept his phone within reach, how the late-night calls got more frequent, how he'd stare out the window longer after hanging up. She was used to him being away, business trips, meetings in Houston or Miami, but lately, the distance between them wasn't just measured in miles. Jackson had stopped talking about the future. He no longer mentioned the trips they'd planned or the restaurant he wanted to open someday as a front for going legitimate. Instead, he came home, poured a drink, and stared at the news without hearing it. This was the backdrop when an old ghost from Vanessa's past stepped back into her life. Earl Maddox was the kind of man who had made a career out of bending trust until it snapped. At 60, he had the polished charm of someone who could talk his way past a bank manager's desk and into a vault without ever raising his voice. Insurance scams, fake investment firms, identity theft, Earl had done it all, usually staying one step ahead of both law enforcement and the people he'd cheated. Vanessa had met him when she was barely out of her teens, working as a hostess in a French Quarter restaurant that catered to tourists with deep pockets. Earl had been twice her age, dressed like a man who lived in penthouses and didn't bother with receipts. He'd slipped her $100 bills like they were business cards and taught her that survival wasn't just about working hard, it was about working smart, even if that meant working dirty. When he called her out of the blue one night, she told herself it was just curiosity that made her answer. They talked for over an hour. Earl had a way of making his voice sound like the safest place in the world, even when the things he said were anything but safe. "You sound tired," he told her. "I'm fine," Vanessa said automatically. "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you sound tired. There's a difference." She laughed it off, but the truth was, she had been tired for a long time, tired of waiting for Jackson to let her into his real world, tired of being told, "Don't worry about it," whenever she asked where he'd been. Earl started calling more often. Sometimes they talked about nothing, old restaurants they missed, music they used to listen to. But other times, he asked questions that made Vanessa think about things she'd been trying not to notice. "He's gone a lot, huh?" "Yeah," she admitted. "And you don't know where?" "No. Doesn't that bother you?" She wanted to say no, but it would have been a lie. It did bother her. Not just because of what it meant about their marriage, but because she had started to see signs, unfiled papers in the office, tax documents tucked away in places they didn't belong, insurance policies she didn't remember signing. One night, while Jackson was in Houston for a client meeting, Vanessa opened the locked cabinet in his office. The key was in his desk drawer, hidden under a stack of business cards from luxury watch dealers. Inside, she found folders labeled in neat block letters. Shipping manifests, bank statements, insurance papers. One document in particular caught her eye, a life insurance policy. Jackson Cole, insured for $750,000, with Vanessa listed as the sole beneficiary. The payout doubled to $1.5 million if the death was accidental or the result of an undetected medical condition. She sat there staring at the numbers, her mind moving faster than her conscience could keep up. $1.5 million. Enough to disappear. Enough to start over anywhere in the world. The thought didn't become a plan overnight. But it lingered, quietly reshaping the way she looked at her husband. His trips became opportunities, his silences became gaps to be filled. And with Earl's voice in her ear, reminding her that the people who get ahead aren't always the ones who play fair, Vanessa began to think about the future in a different way, one where she didn't have to wait for Jackson's promises to come true. What she didn't know was that the FBI's file on Jackson Cole wasn't the only one being written. Somewhere in a different office, an entirely separate investigation was being built, one that would place Vanessa squarely in the middle of a conspiracy she thought she was clever enough to control. By the spring of 2019, the lines between love, loyalty, and danger in the Reynolds household had blurred beyond recognition. On the surface, Elena Reynolds appeared to be living the dream, designer clothes, luxury cars, trips to Miami and Las Vegas whenever the mood struck. But inside the walls of their Charleston, South Carolina home, the air had grown thick with secrets, suspicions, and the unspoken weight of something coming. Jackson Hale, Elena's husband, was no stranger to calculated risk. His import-export business was thriving, at least on paper. But whispers of federal interest were beginning to reach his ears, agents asking questions at the docks, quiet inquiries to former employees, and strange cars parked near his warehouses longer than coincidence allowed. Jackson had survived years in an industry where most men didn't make it past their 40s without a prison sentence or a bullet. But this time felt different. This wasn't the kind of trouble you could buy your way out of. Elena noticed the change before Jackson ever said a word. He was on the phone more, often stepping outside to take calls, his voice low, his tone clipped. Some nights, he didn't come home until after midnight, smelling of salt air and stress. Other nights, he sat in the darkened living room long after she'd gone to bed, the soft glow of his phone screen the only light in the house. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday morning in May. Jackson's phone rang while he was shaving, and Elena, curious, glanced at the caller ID. It wasn't a name she recognized, just unknown number. When he saw her looking, his eyes hardened, and he took the call in the bathroom with the water running, his words drowned out by the noise. Moments later, he emerged, face pale, jaw tight. "I have to go to Houston," he said simply. No explanation. No discussion. Just a command masked as a statement. 2 days later, that trip brought him face to face with someone he hadn't seen in over a decade, his older brother, Mason. Mason Hale had been serving a 20-year sentence in federal prison for armed robbery and attempted murder. But cancer had bought him an early release. He looked like a ghost of the man Jackson remembered, thinner, grayer, but with the same piercing eyes and half-smile that always hinted at trouble. The reunion was brief but heavy with unspoken history. Mason didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for help. All he asked for was time to be with his brother, to feel like family again before the cancer claimed him. Against his better judgment, Jackson agreed. But bringing Mason into his home meant bringing the past right into Elena's lap. When Elena first met Mason, she didn't see a convict. She saw a man who looked almost exactly like her husband but with a looser charm, a slower smile, and an attention that felt intoxicating. Where Jackson was distracted, Mason was present. Where Jackson avoided personal questions, Mason asked them freely, listening as though every word mattered. At first, the visits were innocent. A cup of coffee in the kitchen while Jackson was out. A walk through the garden. Conversations about nothing and everything. But the boundaries blurred quickly. Mason began stopping by when Jackson was away, letting himself in with the key his brother had given him. He wore Jackson's shirts, his cologne, even the gold watch Elena had picked out for their anniversary. And for Elena, those days felt like a strange return to the early years of her marriage, the years when Jackson looked at her like she was the only thing in the room worth noticing. But Mason noticed something else too. He noticed the way Elena's gaze would linger on the liquor cabinet a beat too long. He noticed the locked drawer in Jackson's office, the one she never opened when Jackson was home. And he noticed that whenever the conversation turned to money, Elena's eyes sharpened with interest. That's when Mason realized, Elena wasn't just bored. She was calculating. Her plan had started months earlier, sparked by the discovery of Jackson's life insurance policy, $1.2 million, doubled if his death was ruled accidental or caused by a sudden, undiagnosed medical condition. She'd read the fine print twice, her fingers trembling as she imagined the possibilities. A widow with that kind of payout could disappear, reinvent herself, start over anywhere in the world. She wouldn't just be free from Jackson's shadow, she'd be untouchable. But there was a problem. Jackson was careful, healthy, and too smart to be caught off guard. He didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't trust strangers, and had an instinct for danger that had kept him alive for years. Killing him outright would raise too many questions. So Elena chose patience. She began researching poisons, substances that could mimic natural causes, that could build up slowly in the body without detection. It took months of trial and error, tiny, undetectable doses slipped into wine or tea, to find the right formula. And even then, she planned to stretch it over weeks, letting the symptoms mimic stress and exhaustion until the final dose pushed him over the edge. By the time Mason entered her life, the plan was already in motion. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have accounted for, was that Mason's resemblance to his brother would become the single most dangerous twist in her carefully laid scheme. Because in her mind, she wasn't killing Mason. She was killing Jackson. And Mason, ever the gambler, decided not to stop her. The first real crack in the plan came on a rainy Thursday night in late April. The storm outside rattled the windows of the Charleston house, but inside, everything was still. Lydia sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling aimlessly on her phone, pretending to be distracted. But her mind was locked on one thought: tonight, the final dose. The poison had been building inside Daniel for nearly 2 weeks now, each glass of wine laced with just enough to keep him weak but not suspicious. Tonight, she planned to push him over the edge. Daniel had been complaining about headaches for days. Lydia feigned concern, touching his forehead, suggesting maybe he'd been working too much, maybe he needed to rest. In truth, she was counting the hours. But there was a complication: a phone call he'd taken earlier that day. She'd heard only fragments, muffled from the other room. "Yeah. I'll be back soon, keep everything ready." Daniel was supposed to be leaving for a business trip in the morning, a long one, the kind that usually left Lydia free to breathe. But this time, he'd cancelled it. No explanation. No warning. Just, staying. That meant more time under her roof, more eyes on her, and a much higher risk. When Daniel walked into the kitchen that night, the rain dripping from his jacket, Lydia's stomach tightened. He smiled faintly, tired but watchful. "Storm's bad out there," he said, shaking off his coat. "Makes you think twice about going anywhere." She laughed lightly, masking her nerves. "Guess we're stuck inside together," she replied, pulling down 2 glasses from the cabinet. The wine bottle was already open, she'd made sure of that earlier. Her hands moved with practiced ease, pouring his glass first, then hers. She knew the dosage by heart now. Just enough to finish what she'd started. He took it from her without hesitation, sipping as he leaned against the counter. They talked idly about the weather, about a neighbor's new car, about nothing that mattered. But Lydia's heart was pounding, her eyes flicking to the clock, calculating. 45 minutes after the dose, the symptoms should begin: shortness of breath, dizziness, confusion. She'd already rehearsed her performance, panic in her voice, trembling hands dialing 911, a story about how it all happened so suddenly. But then, something unexpected happened. Daniel set his glass down, still half full, and looked at her in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You've been different lately," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "More attentive. Almost like you're trying to make up for something." She froze for just a second, then forced a smile. "Guess I'm just trying to be a better wife," she said softly. But his gaze didn't soften. "Funny," he murmured, "because I've had this strange feeling for a while now, like I've been living with a stranger." He picked up the wine again, finishing it in 2 long swallows, never breaking eye contact. Lydia felt her throat go dry. Something about the way he drank it, calm, deliberate, made her feel like the script she'd written in her head had just been torn in half. And then, in a move that made her stomach drop, he set the empty glass down and said, "Do me a favor, Lydia. If I ever die unexpectedly, don't tell people it was my heart. Tell them the truth." She forced out a small laugh, but it sounded wrong even to her own ears. "You're being morbid," she said, trying to deflect. But Daniel just smiled faintly, pushed away from the counter, and walked toward the living room without another word. In that moment, Lydia realized the danger had shifted. This wasn't just about whether her plan would work, it was about whether he already knew. And if he did, then every step she took from here would have to be even more precise. Because the smallest slip now wouldn't just ruin the plan. It would ruin her. By the time Malcolm's body was wheeled into the coroner's office, the clock on Tanya's perfect plan was already ticking in reverse. She didn't know it yet, but the first crack in her story appeared almost immediately: and it came from someone she'd never considered a threat. Detective James Hollister had been with the Harris County Sheriff's Office for over 20 years. He'd seen enough domestic homicide cases to know that when a spouse dies suddenly, grief often comes mixed with something else. Tanya's performance at the scene had been flawless, almost too flawless. Her tears were perfectly timed, her voice broke in all the right places. But Hollister noticed the little things, the absence of panic in her eyes when paramedics failed to revive Malcolm, the way she seemed to keep her hands folded neatly instead of trembling, and the quickness with which she mentioned Marcus's supposed heart condition. The official paperwork called Malcolm Marcus Brooks. The driver's license in his wallet matched the name. But fingerprints don't lie, and when the prints hit the federal database, they came back not to Marcus, but to his twin brother, Malcolm. That result was flagged instantly by the FBI's Gulf Coast Task Force. By Wednesday morning, Detective Hollister's office was crowded with agents from multiple agencies, FBI, DEA, and even Homeland Security. It turned out Marcus Brooks had been working as a confidential informant for months, trading insider information about smuggling operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution. And now, the informant's identical twin was dead in his place. The agents didn't need much imagination to guess what had happened. They had audio from a bug planted in Marcus's house weeks earlier, a surveillance measure Marcus himself had agreed to. The recordings captured fragments of conversations between Tanya and Earl, late-night discussions about money, insurance payouts, and accidental deaths. Still, federal prosecutors knew that a case this twisted would need airtight evidence. So they set a trap. That Friday, while Tanya was still arranging the insurance payout with her lawyer, two plainclothes FBI agents knocked on her door. They weren't there to accuse her, not yet. Instead, they offered condolences and explained that because Marcus had been a confidential informant, his death was now part of a sensitive federal investigation. They asked her to come to the field office for a short interview to help close the file. Tanya agreed, confident she could handle whatever questions they threw at her. She'd rehearsed her answers for days. Marcus had been stressed. He'd ignored his health. She'd urged him to see a doctor, but he refused. The heart attack had been sudden and tragic. End of story. But inside the federal interview room, the questions were different. They didn't just ask about Marcus's health, they asked about her relationship with Earl Morrison. They brought up the insurance policy, right down to the double indemnity clause. They showed her surveillance photos of her and Earl at a coffee shop weeks earlier, leaning in close over a laptop. Tanya kept her composure, but a thin crack was forming. Then came the blow she hadn't prepared for. The lead agent slid a tablet across the table and pressed play. It was her voice, clear, calm, unmistakable. The conversation had been recorded in her own living room, 3 nights before Malcolm died. She was talking to Earl about dosage, about how much wine to pour to mask the taste, about how the buildup would mimic a heart condition. She even joked about how Marcus would never see it coming. Tanya went pale. "That's not me," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. The agent didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out another photo, this one of Malcolm, taken from the medical examiner's file. "This," the agent said quietly, "isn't Marcus. You killed the wrong man." The room went silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Tanya stared at the image, her mind scrambling to find an escape route. There wasn't one. While Tanya sat in stunned silence, Earl was being picked up at a motel on the east side of town. He didn't go quietly. He cursed, threatened, and insisted he had nothing to do with Malcolm's death. But when confronted with the same audio recordings, Earl folded faster than anyone expected. He claimed Tanya had masterminded the plan. She'd talked about leaving Marcus for months, but she wanted the insurance money first. He said his role was just to help her figure out how. In court, the prosecution presented a timeline so tight and detailed it left the jury with little doubt. They showed the insurance documents Tanya had found months earlier. They demonstrated how she researched toxins online, sometimes using public library computers to avoid suspicion. They played the recordings of her planning the murder. And most devastating of all, they hammered the fact that she'd killed Malcolm, an innocent man, at least in terms of her intended target. Marcus himself testified. The courtroom fell silent as he described learning about the plot from the FBI, hearing the recordings, and agreeing to let the plan play out so the evidence would be indisputable. He spoke with a measured calm, but his eyes never left Tanya's. "I gave her everything," he said. "And she tried to take everything from me. She just got the wrong man." The verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. Tanya was sentenced to life without parole. Earl received 25 years in exchange for his cooperation. For Detective Hollister, the case became a cautionary tale, not just about greed, but about underestimating the one detail you can't control. For Marcus, it was the end of a dangerous chapter and the start of a life lived in the shadows, still under federal protection. And for Malcolm, the wrong man in the wrong place, it was a brutal reminder that sometimes the deadliest threat doesn't come from enemies, but from someone who thinks they know exactly who you are. Some trials feel like a foregone conclusion from the moment the jury is sworn in. Tanya Brooks's trial was one of them. The evidence wasn't just stacked against her, it was arranged in neat, devastating rows, like dominoes waiting to fall. Every recording, every bank statement, every text message became another brick in the wall closing in on her. From the prosecution's first words, the courtroom understood what kind of story they were telling. This wasn't a tale of a battered woman pushed to the edge, or a desperate spouse acting out of fear. It was a calculated execution, a blueprint for murder drawn up months in advance. And the irony, the part that made it impossible to ignore, was that the wrong man had died. Jurors watched Tanya on the monitors as the recordings played. They heard her own voice, steady and almost cheerful, describing how she'd measured the doses so carefully, how the poison was tasteless and would mimic a heart attack. They listened as she joked with Earl about how the payout would be the easiest money we ever made. No one in the jury box looked away. No one wondered if the tapes were doctored. It was her. Every word was hers. Marcus Brooks took the stand on the third day of testimony. He didn't look like a man trying to save his own skin. He looked like someone who'd been forced to live with the weight of a brother's sacrifice and the betrayal of a wife. He told the jury about the federal investigation, about how he'd agreed to cooperate months earlier, feeding agents details about his competitors in exchange for immunity. He explained how Malcolm's release from prison had been a chance, a dangerous one, to protect himself from the growing heat. He didn't sugarcoat the plan. He admitted that Malcolm had agreed to act as his stand-in, to take his place publicly when Marcus's presence might attract unwanted attention. He spoke about the night Malcolm died, about how he pieced together what Tanya had done, and how he realized she'd never know she'd killed the wrong man until it was too late. The defense tried to paint Marcus as the real villain, a manipulator who had orchestrated everything, using his wife's ambition and resentment as tools. But every time they hinted at a conspiracy to frame Tanya, the prosecutor would return to the recordings. Tanya's own words. Tanya's own handwriting on the insurance documents. Tanya's internet history full of search terms like, poisons that mimic heart attack, and, how to get life insurance payout without autopsy. When Earl Morrison took the stand under the protection of a plea deal, the last pieces clicked into place. Earl's testimony painted Tanya not as a reluctant participant, but as the engine driving the plan forward. She knew exactly what she wanted, Earl said, his voice flat. I just showed her the mechanics. She was the one who kept pushing the timeline. She was the one who said Malcolm, who she thought was Marcus, wouldn't see it coming. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense tried to break him, to suggest he was lying to save himself. But Earl had already admitted to enough crimes to bury him for life. His cooperation had bought him 25 years instead of life without parole, but it had cost him any chance of freedom before old age. He didn't flinch when Tanya glared at him from the defense table. If anything, he seemed almost relieved to tell the truth in full view of the world. The closing arguments left no room for doubt. The prosecution reminded the jury that this wasn't an accident, it wasn't a moment of rage, it was a cold, methodical killing for profit. The defense spoke about love gone wrong, about manipulation and coercion, but their words felt small in comparison to the mountain of evidence. It took the jury just under 4 hours to return. Tanya Brooks was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She sat still, her eyes fixed on a point no one else could see, the perfect mask of the grieving widow now stripped away. Earl Morrison received his sentence a week later. 25 years in a federal penitentiary. For a man already in his 60s, it was effectively a life term. He accepted it without ceremony, nodding once as if he'd always known that this was how his story would end. Marcus Brooks walked out of the courthouse into a wall of cameras. The reporters shouted questions about his business, about his cooperation with the federal task force, about whether he'd orchestrated Malcolm's death. He answered none of them. The only words he spoke were to thank the agents who had helped bring Tanya to justice and to say that his brother had been the best man I ever knew. In the months that followed, Marcus disappeared from public view. His cooperation with the feds had bought him immunity, but not safety. Rumors swirled that he'd left the country, that he was living under a new name somewhere far from Texas. The truth was harder to find, and maybe that was the point. Tanya's life in prison began like anyone else's, stripped of the privileges and illusions she'd built for herself. The other inmates didn't care about her old life, her expensive clothes, or her carefully staged photos. In there, she was just another convicted killer, and one who had made the fatal mistake of thinking she was smarter than everyone else. She never admitted guilt. In every interview request she declined, in every court appeal she filed and lost, Tanya maintained that she'd been manipulated, that Marcus had set her up. But the world had moved on. The headlines faded. The sympathy she once commanded dried up. Even her parents, who had stood by her through the trial, eventually stopped visiting. The last public sighting of Tanya came 2 years into her sentence, during a prison-sponsored charity event. She looked older, thinner, the sharpness in her eyes replaced with something duller, heavier. It was the look of someone who finally understood that there was no second act waiting for her, no escape, no redemption. As for Malcolm Brooks, his story became a strange footnote in true crime circles, the man who died in his brother's place, the unintended victim of a perfect crime that failed on a single, devastating detail. Some saw him as a tragic figure, others as a man who'd simply traded one dangerous life for another. But for those who knew him, the truth was simpler. He'd made a choice. And in the end, that choice had saved his brother. There's a lesson buried somewhere in the wreckage of the Brooks case. Maybe it's about greed. Maybe it's about loyalty. Maybe it's about how the smallest miscalculation can unravel the most careful plan. But for anyone listening closely, it's also about how danger doesn't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes, it's the person sleeping beside you. And that's the part people never see coming.